welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Brooke Lea Foster is an award-winning author and journalist who's worked as a writer and editor at the Boston Globe Sunday Magazine, the Huffington Post, and the Washingtonian. Her novels, Summer Darlings and On Gin Lane, were featured as top summer reads in People magazine, named a top summer pick by Entertainment Weekly, and named one of Parade's best books of summer. Brooke writes the popular Dear Fiction newsletter, and she's the author of 3 nonfiction books. All the Summers in Between is her 3rd novel. Brooke Lea Foster, thank you so much for joining today, and congratulations on your brand new novel, All the Summers in Between. In a starred review, Library Journal calls All the Summers in Between a fun and intriguing read. Author Linda Cohen-Loigman calls it a taut, dynamic examination of friendship, marriage, and the inescapable consequences of who we choose to trust and love. With complex and vulnerable characters, perfectly flawed relationships, and an overwhelming sense of danger, Foster's stunning prose and inspired details almost made me forget just how fast my heart was beating. Author Natalie Jenner says Foster's crisp delineation of character, skill at suspense, and ability to evoke an intriguing time and place hit a new high. And Katie Couric Media says, this one had me racing to turn the pages, pick it up, and cancel your plans for the rest of the week. So with all of that, what can you tell us about All the Summers in Between?
Well, first, I want to say thank you for having me. I'm so excited. That was such a nice introduction. And to be reminded of those quotes right before pub day is so nice because, you're filled with so much jitters, excitement, nerves, right before a book comes out. So I'm like, okay, right. I wrote this thing. Like, people
You
like
did
it.
a good job.
Yeah, exactly. So All the Summers in Between is about 2 friends. It's a dual timeline historical fiction novel. I call it a historical fiction beach read with teeth, but it's about 2 friends who meet in 1967 at the age of 20. They're both in a tough place, I would say, in their life and are kind of needy for someone to get close to. They get close really fast. And then this terrible thing happens, with it, but not between them necessarily, but to them. And it's kind of a shared secret, and they lose touch for 10 years. And the book begins in the latter timeline in 1977, when one of the friends shows up unexpectedly at the other's doorstep. And she's carrying some baggage and she's carrying some drama, and she says, I need your help. And the other friend, who has been living, as a housewife for a while with her daughter and husband, putting aside a lot of her dreams, is suddenly faced with the question, do I want to accept this woman back in my life, this old close friend of mine? And she does, but with a lot of trepidation, and there's a lot of complication that goes on between them. I wrote this book in part because I just feel like we all struggle with our friendships so much. I've had so many close friends who I've gotten closer to over the years, and I've had a lot of close friends who I've grown distant from over time. And I just think friends make for really rich subjects in a book. And in my last book, On Gin Lane, I had a friendship that between these 2 women who they relied on each other so much. And it was such a small part of the book, but it interested me so much more. So I knew that I wanted to kind of dive into that a little more in my next one. So this is that book.
What was the spark that started this particular story for you?
I love that question. Okay, so I was on vacation in Maine with my family. I had finished my book On Gin Lane. So I was at a point where I was open to ideas. As a writer, you're sort of always keeping your eyes open. And there are points when your heart and your mind, I like to say, are just kind of clearer. They're freer. You're daydreaming. You're looking for ideas, even though you don't realize you're looking for ideas. So
Mhm.
we were staying in this inn on the water, and they had this lovely perk where you could take a small boat into town to have dinner. So we thought, oh, great, let's get on the boat. So it's like this little Boston whaler, and we're taking it across the harbor to dinner. And I look up, and there was this adorable gingerbread Victorian kind of up on a grassy hill from the water. And there was a woman hanging laundry on a line. She was young, and she had a little girl doing cartwheels at her feet.
Mm.
And I just looked at that scene and I thought it looked so old fashioned. You know, Maine has a way of bringing you back in time. I don't know if you've ever been there,
Mhm.
but it's
Mhm.
yeah, it's a very grounding place, Maine, and it
Yeah.
feels, you know, you really feel like you can remember what the beach looked like before it got crowded or developed. You know, there's so much more wilderness around. So my mind was already kind of percolating just from being up there. We had stayed in these little cottages before this that looked like they were from the 1950s. It was like an old summer colony. So that already had me.
Oh,
Yeah, it
yeah.
was really cool. But anyway, as I was looking at this woman on the hill with her daughter, I kid you not, there was this beautiful teak sailboat that just kind of sailed by. And being a writer is such a funny thing because it was a snapshot, and I immediately could see these two friends. I could see this, you know, local hard scrabble girl that grew up, a woman now who grew up in a beach town and is still living there and had a daughter now and cast aside a lot of her dreams. And then this kind of wealthy city girl, old friend of hers who kind of cruises into town in this very glamorous boat. And I just like knew that this boat would arrive in this inlet and there would be this tension between them. From there, I had nothing else. I just could immediately see those two women. And I remember looking at my husband and my kids on the way. I think we were like going under the welcome to New Hampshire or Massachusetts
Mhm.
sign as we were leaving Maine and saying, like, I think I have my next book idea. And from there, it's just started unraveling. But yeah, it really started with the imprint of those two things. It was like the woman on the hill and the boat coming in, and just knowing that it would go back in time and I would be in the latter 60s and later 70s, which is a time period that I hadn't really explored yet in my books. My
Mm.
first book was in 1962 in Martha's Vineyard, and my second was 1957 in Ongeon Lane. So I
Mhm.
wanted to push into this new time period because it was, you know, the roles of women had changed so much by then, and it was such an interesting time to mine. So yeah, so from there they sort of unspooled, and then I had to figure out what the plot was and the story and who these characters really were, but that's how it began. That was the spark.
Is that how it normally is for you? Does it normally sort of do you get, like, a snapshot from a scene like that, or is it always different?
No, it's always different. And you know, I was a journalist for years, and you were a journalist too,
I
correct?
was, yes, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know,
Mhm.
how did we get our ideas? We get our ideas from a million different places. So with my first book, Summer Darlings, I actually got that idea from flipping through one of those glossy real estate magazines on vacation, you know, where you're looking at the
Mhm.
houses and wishing you could buy one of the $4 million ones. Like
Yep.
it was that. And I came to this one page that had an ad for this house that was built back in like the 40s. They called it an old fishing camp, but now it was called the Swindle. And it had this whole story about how this little camp was built between like a glamorous Broadway star's house and then like Kennedy-esque like family on the other side. And it was just like a short paragraph, but I immediately was like, that's a novel. And I have had, you know, as a journalist, I had so many ideas for articles all the time. And then in my lifetime, I had so many book ideas, fiction ideas that just would come in and then they would kind of flutter away. You know, they never
Mhm.
dug their hooks into me. But with that story, when I had that idea, and then as I was on vacation those 2 weeks with my family, I started seeing the characters, like one would bike by on the beach, and then I would hear like the guy and the girl having a conversation. And I know it sounds so crazy, but that's how that one unfolded, which was just from an advertisement. So it's just, and then
Mhm.
on Gin Lane, I do have to tell you if you're interested in origin stories, because this is so interesting too.
Yeah.
When I was researching Summer Darlings, I needed one line. It was like a factoid for one line, which is like, where would a society woman stay in 1957 if she was going to Chicago? You know, what would be the
Mhm.
hotel? And I ended up finding out that it was the Palmer House, most likely that she would stay in Chicago. And then happened upon this story about how Potter Palmer was the original owner of that hotel in the late 1880s and gifted it to his wife as a surprise wedding present, this hotel. And it
Wow.
was the most glamorous. It was like the Plaza Hotel of New York. That's what I always think of.
Yeah.
Um, and after he gifted it to her, it burned to the ground like 10 days later, and their whole life had been like trying to rebuild this hotel. And when I read that, I thought, if I ever have a chance, if I on this earth, if I can write a second novel, that I'm going to use that general plot but move it all to the Eastern Long Island. And that was my second book. So they come from all these funny places, these ideas. I think as writers, and you probably know this too, you just kind of have to be open for them
Mm.
to kind of bloom inside of you. You have to be ready for it, and you have to be, because we see interesting stories all around us all the time.
Yeah.
And it's the ones that just kind of capture us and then we can't stop thinking about that end up becoming books, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah. I love that idea of letting it bloom inside of you. That's a really beautiful way to put it.
thank you.
You mentioned that your All the Summers in Between is set in the 60s and 70s, and that this was a slightly new time period for you. What was it that interested you about this particular 1967, 1977?
That's a good question. So, okay, so to explain that answer, I just want to quickly go back in time a little bit, because I think to understand where women were in the late 60s, you sort of have to watch where they came from before that.
Mhm.
So I always say that in the 40s, that was the most exciting, it was a very exciting time for women because many of them were out in the workplace, men were off to war, and they were doing jobs that they had never really had a chance to do before, working at newspapers. It's like a league of their own when they were the baseball players, right? That's really what was happening. And then when the 1950s came, there was all this pressure to go back into the home. Some women were likely very happy to go lead that life because maybe they didn't want to be working and that life didn't suit them. And then there were a lot of women who felt pressure to be there and didn't really want to have their entire life centered around the nuclear family and cooking dinner and massaging their husband's feet and lighting a fire before they get home, which is all stuff that were in Cosmo articles at the time, like how to
Wow.
keep your husband happy. Light a fire before he gets home. I was like, what? Massage his feet. I was like,
Get
that's
ready
a
for the
really
foot
nice
massage.
thought. I know. And women were like going to the grocery store in kitten heels and like they all looked fabulous, but inside there was all this deep unhappiness that started to kind of rot rot away at people's souls. And Betty Friedan captured all of that in The Feminine Mystique, which comes out in 1962.
Mhm.
So until the early 60s, that's sort of where women were. But I wanted to set my book at a time where in the late 60s, where women suddenly had all this hope and there's all this change happening around them. And, yes, there's been the big assassinations, and there's been these marches, civil rights marches, but women are suddenly front and center in the conversation. They're saying we want, equal pay. The Equal Rights Amendment is getting discussed in Congress for, a sex discrimination aspect to it. That's really getting talked about and being taken seriously in the late 60s. And Woodstock is going to happen. And, there's the big march on Washington, and there's a big march in New York City, actually, for women. And so women are sort of at this point riding the tide of change and thinking our lives are really going to look differently than our mothers. And I wanted my characters, Thea and Margot, at the age of 20, to be very wrapped up in that, to be listening to the music that everyone was listening to back then and thinking about how much their lives, were going to change. And they really believe in that. And so a lot of the conversations in my earlier timelines are really about like, can you believe what our moms were like? And can you believe what it's going to be like for us? And let's look at we can do anything.
Mhm.
And then the 70s are so interesting because a lot of that hope falls flat, like a
Mhm.
big hangover. And 10 years later, these same women who believed in all this change and hope and there was so much excitement are suddenly living very traditional lives. They're finding that they actually are living very similar lives to their mothers. They put aside their dreams like their mothers did. They're, staying at home and they're doing the majority of the chores and all these things that women are still talking about, right? Was
Mhm.
happening at that point. And I just love the idea of the like comparing women in those two times and just showing how they thought it was going to be one way, but there was all this disappointment. And when the two friends reunite, they sort of look at each other and they're able to kind of reflect and see just how much they let go of themselves. And
Mm,
I think that's important because I think that there are people in our lives, there's touchstones in our lives that we sort of realize that we've come far from who we wanted to be. And those
yeah.
reminders can be very powerful because we can then say to ourselves, well, maybe things should be different. And that's what my characters end up doing in the 1977 timeline. They start questioning everything all over again and think, did I take the right course? Am I happy? Should I ask for more? Um, and I was talking with author friends last night. We were talking about the threads that kind of run through all of our books and why we have certain things we're obsessed with and we can't let go of.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, what is mine? And I think it connects to what I'm saying, which is that I love to write about women who are trying to find the courage to tell the people they love that they need more, they want more. And that really runs through all of my books. And I think that is such a universal truth, right? For all of us
Mhm.
as women. I think that's something I struggle with still to this day. Going to my husband, I remember when I wanted to write a novel even and take this creative time that felt very unproductive and wasteful,
Mhm.
and having the courage to say to him, like, I kind of want to try this, like, so I love that kind of moment for women. So yeah, I think that's why I chose that time period, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And you've said that what keeps you writing is that you're searching for something in the
Yes.
writing. I think this was kind of, we were just touching on this, but what do you mean by that exactly? And in all the summers in between in particular, what were you searching for?
Ooh, that's a good question. I got to think about that one. So, I think with all of my books, and I think it's true for all authors actually, there's just questions that we have. And I
Mhm.
think sometimes I don't even know that I have these questions. I don't even know that I am thinking about these things, but my subconscious is.
Mhm.
And with friends, you know, I made it's like you have your childhood friends that you make when you're young. And
Mhm.
then when I became a mom, and then you have your college friends, right? You have your kind
Yeah.
of 20s career friends. And then when I became a mom, I remember thinking to myself, these are just temporary friends. Like these are just friends you go
Mhm.
talk to at the playground and you kind of talk about like getting your kids to sleep. And these friends they're not my real friends in a way, right? Which is kind
Yeah.
of it is insulting. But it was back in the early days when my 14-year-old was like in 2 or 3.
Mhm.
And then as time goes on, you actually realize, no, these are my friends. These are my really good friends. And then I would go back in time, or not, sorry, I wouldn't go back in time. I would go visit my best friend from childhood, and we would be sitting there. And sometimes, and we're so close, but sometimes I would think, if we met today, would we still be good friends?
Mhm.
So I think juggling all of these ideas of what friends mean to us at different points in our lives and why
Yeah.
we need them at different ages just really interested me. Um, and I think we need our friends so differently in our 20s. I know at least I
Mhm.
did. I mean, when I was a teenager and probably in college around Margot and Thea's age, I leaned on my friends so much more. I think I looked to them to make me feel interesting, to help me
Mhm.
fill out my identity, to bounce ideas off of, to figure out what do I believe if they believe this. You're sort of
Mhm.
using them as a sounding board, a developmental. There was just so many things that it was such a critical, close relationship. And this idea that my two characters at age 20 got so close so fast felt very real to me because I always felt that way with friends at that age. We just felt like we were woven together like a braid. It was just like you were just so close. And then when you get married and you have children, you don't have that, and you age, you don't have that need anymore. Your
Yeah.
identity is more developed. You feel more solid as to who you are. You know your own true north, right? We all know who
Mhm.
we are a little more. And so our friends become supports and they become someone you laugh with and someone you're, complaining about your husband with or whatever it is. You just need them so differently. And that interested me because it's like, why, what's more important and what do we need? And so all those questions were humming inside of me. as I sat down to write this book. And so I think even though I didn't realize I was working through those questions, I was. And I
Yeah.
think in this book, okay, so there's another friend in the book. Her name is Midge, and she's a mom friend. And
Hmm.
I put that in because I loved Thea, my main character, kind of looking at this old friend and then having this newer friend and thinking that the newer friend was like not as close, not as worth her time. But there's a point in the book where she has this realization, it's just different. We just are
Yeah.
different type of friends, but she's still important to me and I still love her, So yeah, I find all that stuff very interesting.
Yeah. Uh, all of your novels so far are set in summer as well. You
Yes.
say you believe in the transformational summer.
Yes.
This one has two transformational summer. What is the transformational summer?
So I grew up in the Northeast in Eastern Long Island where this book is set. And it was cold, it would get dreary. We waited all year for our summers.
Mhm,
And when summer came, it was a time of growth, development. It was like kissing boys behind the lifeguard stand in Montauk. It was like
mhm,
friends going on road trips. There were so many deep discussions. I grew up on the beach. I grew up 3 houses away from the cliff where down to the Long Island Sound, where there was a 168 steps down to our beach. And when we got down there, it's a very modest neighborhood, but when you got down there, it was a private beach down there. So no one was there. And I would go down there as a kid. I would take my dog. I mean, if my parents were fighting, I would go down there. If I was worrying about something, I would go down there. If I was happy, I just spent so much time daydreaming on the beach. And so summer to me is really a time where you figure stuff out and you grow and you change. And
mhm.
that's why I always set my books at the beach because I do
Uh-huh.
think, and in summer, because I do think for me, I did so much of my growing during that time. And so I like the idea of my characters doing the same thing. And, with this book, it was my first book that was dual timeline. So both of my previous books began Memorial Day weekend and ended Labor Day weekend. And, I do believe that in that time frame, the 2.5 months or 3 months, whatever it adds up to actually be, we do kind of find a little piece of ourselves. We kind of tap back into who we really are and where our heart is and really what we want in life. At least for
Mhm,
me, that's how
mhm.
summer always is. So I, even now with kids fighting and playing in the water and splashing each other and trying to quiet them down and keep everyone happy and chopping fruit, whatever it is I'm doing as a mom, I'm still on the beach with my notebook, with a book. I'm looking out at the water and I'm daydreaming. And that's really, I love that time. So I tend to do a lot of my best thinking in summer and idea generating. And then I use winter to kind of burrow in and get deep and write. So
That's great. I like that, the idea generating in summer and then winter for
yes, it's like get up,
burrowing and
yes,
writing.
cozy up and get my tea. It's like I always have my hot cup of tea and yeah.
What is your whole process like? From when you get the idea, the spark that we've been talking about, from when you first get that idea to when you've got your sort of first full draft. What's
Yes.
your what is your process like?
Okay, so I always joke that I write like quick and dirty and rough because from being a journalist, I just like to get it on the page and I do not worry if it's pretty. I don't worry if it sounds great. There are some authors who stop themselves every 5 minutes to make a beautiful sentence. I am not that author because
Mhm,
my years in journalism have taught me to just get it down on paper. So that's really what I'm working my hardest on is just figuring out who the characters are, what the story is, what the arc's going to be. And so if you were to ever read my first draft, you would be like, this is horrible and it doesn't make any sense. And I'd be like, I agree with you. And that's okay. Because in writing, that's what you do. You revise, you chisel, you find the statue that's buried in the marble. And
mhm,
I've really always been okay with that. And I think from years of being edited by different editors, I'm used to the idea that sentences are going to come and go. I remember, actually, it's not even with my first book, it's with all of my books. Sometimes I put in placeholder dialogue and I know I'm going to go back and I'm going to make the dialogue so much better, but I put it in knowing generally what they're going to say, but I just want to get to
mhm.
the end of the chapter. Um, I will say with this book, with the dual timeline, it was the first time I tackled that, and it was so hard. It was so hard. I mean, you are basically writing two different novels and then cramming them together into one. So you just have so much less space in each timeline.
Mhm.
So, I wrote very long, and then I went back and cut and, pushed different chapters together and figured out what parts of the story didn't need to be there, didn't move the plot forward. But I really kept them as two separate documents. So in the beginning, my very first draft, and when I say my very first draft, what I mean is like my 100th draft, right? Because it's like I'm just keep working on it for 6 months
Yeah.
straight. It's like there's like a new draft every day. It's like some variation. But there, I wrote the first 3 chapters from the later timeline. And then I would sort of feel a natural break to go back in time. So then I wrote some of that. Then I would go forward. And I did that till about the midpoint. And at that point, I said to myself, I can't write another word of what happened later unless I figure out everything in the past. So then I just pulled all the past chapters out, put it in a separate Word doc, and I wrote that whole story until the very end, except for the final chapter that I waited till both timelines were done to write the final chapter. But yeah, so that's what I ended up doing. And then I did the same thing for the latter timelines. And then I went back to thread them together. And I did the exact same thing with my 4th book that I just finished, which is also dual timeline. And that one's dual POV too. So it's like
Oh,
every
wow.
time, I know. It's like every time you have to, for me, it's like I want to grow as a writer and challenge myself. So
Mhm.
I'm like, wow, I just made it like that much harder. But I loved having the dual POV because in this book, it's a mother and a daughter. And the mother's point of view is in 1965 and the daughter is 1978. And it's really cool because in the first timeline, in the 1965 timeline, the daughter's pretty young. So it's neat to kind of play with age and memory and what you remember. And, but yeah, I did the exact same thing. It was like, you have to know the history and the past in order to ever write the present. But yeah, so anyway, hundreds of drafts and I accepted. And I like Ann Hull, this famous reporter at the Washington Post, who I adore. She once said in a conference, rewriting is a gift. And I really believe that. I think rewriting and revising and reworking a story every day is such a gift. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean I'm not ripping my hair out and like going for a run so I'm not frustrated, but it is a gift. There's not many jobs you get to do over. So
Do you enjoy it? I mean, I know you say it's, but do you enjoy that sort of revision process, really getting
I
in there?
love it. So I actually love revising so much more than the first draft, writing down the first draft, because
Mhm.
that's what I mean about placeholder dialogue and just getting things down, because I'm much better at kind of going deep in one chapter and just kind of playing in that chapter for a
Mhm.
while than I am just, I don't know, the quick and dirt, like I'm just like, get it out of me, get it out.
Yeah.
But I love going back and changing the sentences and figuring out, a lot of times with my books, I'll start the book in a place that doesn't end up being the first chapter. So with All the Summers in Between, I had my character Thea in 1978. It was a scene at home with her daughter and the husband. I don't totally remember exactly what was happening, but it was that they were definitely in the house. And then I thought to myself, it's just not, there's not enough here. We need to like give the reader a better sense of how the story is going to unfold and why we're telling the story at this very moment. And that's when I came up with the idea of it being her 30th birthday party when this book begins, because then there's so much more at stake. She's turning 30. You get all of these little tense interactions with her husband and her best friend, and you get the sense that she's not happy at her 30th birthday party. And there's this, I'm not giving anything away because it's the first chapter, but there's this, like, for me, it was so heartbreaking moment where she realizes that like the cake she baked is melting and no one's going to sing to her, and she's upstairs with her daughter and her husband's on the phone, and she brings it out, like her own cake out, and starts
Yeah.
slicing it on her birthday. And that to me captures so much of what her life had become, whereas my original opening chapter didn't. So I think opening chapters and ending chapters are really fun to do once you're done, because then you can really figure out what the story needs to like launch the reader in. um yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what you're trying to say in the first and last. I got once you finally got
Yeah.
first.
And no, totally. And then also what I always do with the ending chapter is I'll reread the whole book. And then when I get to that last scene where I know I need my final chapter, I'll like put very sad music on and then I just kind of write to it and I channel just those characters' emotions and I get so weepy. I mean, I just like when I reread these scenes, like I remember the end of Anjin Lane, there's this moment where she's just like saying goodbye to this woman protege who took her under her wing. And it's just having them say goodbye was so emotional. And similar with this book, I'm not going to say what happens, but by the end, when I was writing it, I knew exactly what they needed to say to each other to make it okay and to figure it out, whatever was going to happen between them. And I remember writing it and being like, oh my gosh, this is a hard day. Like sometimes I go to pick up at 3 o'clock to get my daughter and I have my eyes crossed and I'm like, do you know what I've been through? And everyone's like, can you carpool to lacrosse? And it's like, oh yeah, sure. Meanwhile, it's like I'm this weirdo coming with like wiping tears from my eyes. But you get so into these characters and they are such a part of you and you care about them so much. So by the end, it's like, oh my gosh. Yeah.
You've mentioned dialogue a couple of times, and I wanted to talk to you about dialogue. Let's talk about it for a minute because
Yeah.
you've shared in interviews before that when you're drafting your dialogue in particular and you set placeholder dialogue, you feel like it comes out not so great. But I can tell you that the finished product is very well crafted.
Oh, thank you.
So can you share your approach to dialogue? How do you go from that placeholder dialogue to your better finished product?
So I think with the placeholder dialogue, it's kind of the most superficial thing that could be said in the moment, right?
Mhm,
So I remember what I'm trying to get at between the two characters. And then when I go back in, what I'm thinking about is how would people really speak if they were feeling guilty, if they were feeling sad, if they were feeling resentful, how would they say it? Because they probably wouldn't be this straightforward, right? We talk in code and we
mhm,
have to learn to decode each other and figure out what we're really saying. So then what I try to do is have a lot of times they're having a conversation about something that's completely unrelated. I mean, that's completely different than what's really being talked about. So
mhm,
I wish I could remember a scene from All the Summers in Between, but I feel like it happens a lot with her and her husband
mhm,
where they're having, oh, I can remember one. So this is early on too, so I'm not giving anything away. But early on, she and her husband are laying in bed talking and he says like, I noticed you stopped taking your birth control pills.
mhm,
And she's like, oh, well, it's been hard. And what we see in this very subtle, short dialogue between them is the pressure he's putting on her to have a
mhm,
baby, her inability to say she may not be ready. She's trying to say that, but she really can't
mhm,
outright say it. So she kind of makes excuses for why she has stopped taking her pills. And, so I think that's a perfect example of like, I'm sure what was there before was like, you should have stopped taking it's like very obvious. And then I go back and try to be a little more artful. Um, and realistic in the way people speak. I actually am fascinated by the way people speak. I think that's my journalist ear,
mhm,
right? For so many years, listening to other people and transcribing what their words were. And I have always felt like, we all have certain things we're good at and certain things we're not so good at in our jobs. But one of the things I've always been good at as a journalist is hearing what someone's really trying to tell you, even though they're not saying it.
mhm,
And I could always kind of think to myself, ooh, that this is what I have to ask. They're talking about, like, I'm trying to think of an example. Like, they're talking about how her and her husband, like this woman and her husband maybe traveled on their honeymoon and it was like this crazy travel day. But what she's really saying is that her husband didn't do anything to help. And she was waiting on the line by herself. And like I'm making this whole thing up, but like he's
yeah,
on his phone and she's like waiting in the ticket line and then she's getting whatever it is, like I could just always hear what was really percolating. And then I think that's what helped me get good interviews because then I could say
yeah,
what's the next beat and what's the beat after that. And so I use a lot of that in my fiction. Um, yeah, and I think too, I I have like the ear from journalism of just knowing the way quotes should be used and when you need to kind of pull back
mhm,
and let the
mhm,
camera lens pull out and when you need to kind of focus in on the face and hear what they're saying. And
yeah,
so there's like a rhythm to that. and
Mm-hmm.
a music almost. I feel like that's cheesy, but that's kind of what it feels like sometimes, when I read back my work. It's like
Mm-hmm.
this is the moment, like you need to hear this particular type of statement.
Mm-hmm.
So I play with all of that, and I love dialogue. I actually, in my fourth book that I just finished, that takes place on Martha's Vineyard, I said to my agent, I feel like there's not enough interiority, because I'm like, I love those authors that do interiority so well. I'm like amazed by interiority because it's one of my weaknesses as a writer. And she was like, don't worry about that. You're so good at dialogue and you reveal so much in dialogue. And I was like, really? Like, I don't need more interiority. And she's like, no, I mean, it's there. It's just like, that's what you do. And I was like, that's true. So I was like, okay. She's like, take this story that you kind of give us a paragraph on and put it in dialogue. And I did that, and it like really changed the scene. So I
Wow.
actually think I have to even lean on dialogue a little more sometimes. I don't realize, I think some of the things that we kind of our strengths, sometimes we're like, oh, but I want to be like this author and I want to be able to do this. But it's like, no, I'm doing this well. So, use that. So,
Yeah, and then that's the thing that you do differently,
right.
depending
That
on
makes your
what,
work
yeah.
unique, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I do love certain writers with interiority though, where you're like 3 pages of it and you're like, wow, I
And
know
you're not
everything.
bored. It is,
No,
it's like,
it's
it's
amazing.
totally
I'm
fine.
like, how do they do that? I feel like I can't quite do that yet. That's also the journalist in me, right? It's like
Mhm.
succinct, short. It's
Mhm.
like, that's just, yeah, I've been trained a certain way.
How did you make the move from being a journalist to being a novelist?
So as someone, I mean, I just spent my whole life in bookstores, right? I just love fiction. I've always read so much fiction. And starting with like Nancy Drew, right? With the
Mhm.
books we all fell in love with as kids. And then I remember reading Beatrice Williams' 100 Summers. I don't remember, I think I was in my 30s maybe when that book came out. And I was just knocked out by what you could do combining historical research and fiction writing. So it
Mhm.
felt, when I read that, I just remember thinking, oh, it's not World War II. It takes place in Newport at the beach in 1938 and 1931. It was so unique to me. And I just loved it. And then a couple years later, read Fiona Davis's The Dollhouse, which, came out and was about a young woman living at the Barbizon Hotel in New York City. And that also wasn't World War II historical fiction. And it was about a young woman kind of finding herself at that time. Um, and I was just so interested in those types of books, where you would do tons of reporting and research, just like a journalist, but then you could have a more creative voice.
Yeah.
Um, I had spent so many years writing in the voices of other publications. I could write a freelance article for the New York Times, and then I could do a People magazine short thing. And then I could, you can jump around and you can take on the voices of publications as a freelancer, which I was in my later part of my career, very easily. You just kind of can do that. But there was a point where I really wanted to use my own voice. I wanted to discover what I had to say, and not just report on other people's lives, but write a story that would belong to me.
Mhm.
Um, and so I had that idea in Martha's Vineyard, like I had told you guys about. And then I said to my husband, I was like, I just feel like I have to try. And I'm so scared to not take paying assignments for a few months, but I just want to try.
Mhm.
And I signed up for a course at Sarah Lawrence College, which is near my house, which had a fiction writing course. And we had to write an entire manuscript. You had to come in the class with an entire manuscript completed.
Wow.
And yeah, and I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm just going to do it. And it's going to be like a mess, but whatever. So I wrote a really rough, it was like a 3/4 done manuscript, and I turned it into the teachers there, and I got in the class. And that really changed my life, because it was suddenly being around other people who were either former doctors or lawyers, lots of different type walks of life, stay-at-home moms. There was no men, weren't any men in my class, so I'm not trying to leave men out here. But and yeah, and we were critiquing each other's work. And I remember my teachers at the time, who one is Jim and Han, who wrote The Apology, whose book was just amazing and came out to much critical acclaim last year. But I
Mhm.
remember being in that class and having them be like, when your book comes out and when your book finishes, and they would just talk like it was happening. And that was part of their thing, right? Like, is to help writers believe in themselves. But it helped me because I was like, yeah, okay, when my book comes out, so I just kept working on it little by little. And it took, with Summer Darlings, it was like 3.5 years before I got it, before I sold it to an editor. I had an agent
Was
a year.
Summer Darlings that manuscript that you took into that
Yes,
workshop? So your
yes,
first,
it was.
wow, that's great.
Yes, it was. And it was, like I said, though, it was really bad. I mean, I remember the first day we workshopped and you kind of wait for everyone to go around and say something, and everyone was kind of looking down and no one wanted to say anything. And I was like, okay, is it that bad? And I remember my teacher, Jimin, looking at me and she was like, well, let's start here. What are you trying to say? And we got in a conversation about what I was actually trying to write. And what I realized in that first workshop class is I actually didn't know what I wanted to write. I just kind of wrote a bunch of stuff down and I didn't know what the story was. And that was the beginning of figuring out what's the story and what am I trying to say, which goes back to, finding your voice as a writer, as an individual writer. Creative writing is so much scarier than journalism. Journalism, you can hide out in facts and the
Mhm.
formulaic writing is much, I mean, even though I did creative nonfiction, it was still, using your own voice and putting that out on the page, your own creative voice and putting that on the page was terrifying. It was so much more vulnerable. And I feel that way even with book 4. I mean, I talk to my author friends who are on like book 12 and they feel that way. It's just very scary to put yourself out there in this way. It's very different. And so when, um, when you see people on, say, Bookstagram who tag you and they like hate your book, you're like, why did you tag me? Just say you hate the book, like that's a thing.
Yeah.
That author friends and I talk about, yeah, just because it's your heart, and I get not everyone's gonna love,
Well, it's fine
not
for
everyone's
people not to
gonna love
like
what
it.
you
I don't
do.
understand why they need to tag an author and say they
Yeah,
didn't
I
like it. You
know.
can
You're
have
like,
your
don't
opinion.
tell us.
Yeah.
Just put it out there. I don't
Yeah.
need to see it. Yeah, but that's why it hurts because you really do, it's you. It feels like your heart out there on the line.
Yeah. What was the road to publication then like for you? So you've done the workshop, you
So
found
I did
your
the
authorization.
workshop and so I had, I think a little bit because I was a journalist, I did feel like I was ready to submit before I think, because I was like, oh, I kind of know how to write. Like I can submit this now. So I remember reaching out to 20 agents, probably after 2 years of working on my first book, Summer Darlings. And no, sorry, I reached out not to 20. Sorry, it was like 12. And 8 of the 12 wanted the full submission. So I was feeling so good because I was like,
Wow.
oh, okay, wow, this is really great. Like all these people want to read it. Like someone's going to take me on. And when they read it, they all said no. So I thought to myself, okay, I clearly have a lot more work to do. I didn't say, oh, there's something wrong with them. I could just, as a journalist, when you get that kind of feedback, something's not working. So I actually didn't take it personally at all. I just thought, okay, I'm going to dig into this book for another year. So I signed up for another novel class at Sarah Lawrence in between freelancing. I was still freelancing as a journalist at that point and kind of juggling that. And from there, yes, so I spent the whole next year revising the book, changed so much. It really did. And then I went to a publishing conference that was being put on in New York where you could pay like one of those like $40 speed dating with agents sessions.
Mhm, mhm.
I don't know if you've heard about those, but they
Yeah.
exist.
Mhm.
And I paid for two because there were two agents I was interested in. And the woman the first woman I met with was a very nice woman who we just didn't click. And the second one was Rebecca Shearer, and she's my agent. She sat down across from me and we just started gabbing. Like it was just like we were old friends, and she was so much younger than me. But we just had such a great talk. And she's like, I read your pages. I love the pages. I want to read the full manuscript. Um, and so I sent it to her, and then I didn't hear back from her for like 6 to 8 weeks. It was a while. And I was so bummed because I was like, oh, we had such a good connection and rapport.
Yeah.
Um, And then I emailed her to follow up, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I never got this. I can't believe you sent it to me. I was actually thinking about you the other day." So it ended up in her spam folder. It's like a
Oh my
dream,
God.
right? As a writer, you think you're being rejected, but actually it was actually that story where it went into her spam folder. So I was so glad I had that pleasant persistence, right? And like
Yeah.
emailed her this like friendly hello. Um, so I resent it to her and she read it right away. And then she had me do some more work on it. She saw some flaws in it. So this is like, I had to be very patient with this process. This was not an easygoing process for me. It went on for literally 4 years. And then once we were done with those revisions, she was like, "We're ready." So we went out on a Monday, went out meaning she went to the major houses, the editors at the major houses who she thought might like the book. The first two said no kind of quick. The third one said that they loved the story, but they wanted a dual timeline novel. So they wanted me to actually cut half the novel and write another time period in the novel. And the editor that said that is someone who I really respect as an editor and whose books I love. And my agent was like, "You know what? You just don't have to do that. Like, don't be fooled. Like, we're going to sell this book. Like, this book
Mhm.
is good as it is." And I was like, "Okay." And then it was like the beginning of week 3 that we got two people who were interested, and so that was like the big excitement.
Mhm.
Because you're just so crazy at that time. All you want is the deal. So I was checking my email 100 times a day. I was like, I always joke about cutting fruit, and I know I already said it, but it's like you're literally cutting fruit for your kids, and all you're thinking about is like, "Oh my God, am I going to hear something today?" But so exciting. So it was my editor at the time, Kate Dresser, who signed me, and then we did more work on the book. But you know what? It was so worth it because when the book came out, it was ready, and I learned how to write a book writing that book. Not to say that I am an old pro now and can just do it because every single book is hard and has its own challenges, but that book taught me how to create an arc and what it means to develop a character. I mean, when I started out, I honestly didn't even realize that. I mean, it's going to sound so bad to say it, but like I didn't even realize that like the end of the book, the character should be in a completely different growth place than she was at the beginning. Like I just didn't know how to do it yet. I
Mhm.
didn't know that there were tricks. So yeah, so that was how. And then, since then it's been when Summer Darlings came out, it did well enough that I was lucky enough to be able to be asked for another idea, and I had one ready, and then wrote that one. And actually, no, I shouldn't say. So they asked me for ideas, but I'm actually not a writer that sells on proposal. I like to write the whole thing
Mhm.
because I'm very some writers, I don't know if your listeners know this, but some writers will pitch like a couple paragraphs and they get a book deal and then write the book. But I actually like to write the whole book because I like to have control over the story until the end. It just freaks me out that I'll promise something that I can't quite deliver and the story will evolve and change. And
Mhm.
I've already been contracted for this other story. I've since learned that editors are very patient with that and they're very willing to work with a changing story. But still, I like to write the whole thing. With all of my books, I've written the whole thing first. So yeah, and so then with all the summers in between, I ended up getting a 2-book deal, which for an author is like you just cry. It's like,
Mhm.
really, you believe in me that much? So yeah, so that's why I just finished the 4th one because I was contracted. I had to write that one fast. Um, so that one's coming out next summer.
That was my next question. When's the next one
Yeah,
coming out? And congratulations on the next one too.
thank you. Thank you.
What uh what's your best piece of advice for aspiring authors?
Oh, goodness. Okay, I have so many. One of them is just like a time thing. Like get your butt in the chair. I always say that because
Mm.
even though you may not have 3 to 4 hours a day to write a book. I get it. But your mind can be in the book. So if you're working another job, take 15 minutes to like scribble down some ideas, do a little bit of research at night when instead of watching TV, do a character outline, just try to keep your head in the book every single day because as soon as you take 2 weeks away, you're working that much harder to catch up. And it's really, really hard. Um, and the writing will go faster and smoother if you just are very familiar with where you want to go in the story. But my number 2 piece of advice is more coming from the heart, which is don't be afraid to use your voice. Don't be afraid to take a risk and write down your story and what you have to say. People want to hear it. We want to know what your story's about. I think there's so much trepidation, there's fear. I mean, at least I had it about, using your own creative voice. And it's okay that you have to develop it and practice it to make it good enough for to put it out there. It's fine. You'll get there. Just relish that part of the journey because it's all about the learning. I think with writing, you're a lifelong learner and you're always trying to improve. So you're never going to be the writer, this famous writer person that you admire. You're going to be you, and don't be afraid to be you and really follow your own voice. So I'm trying to think if there's another one that I like to say. Oh, don't be precious with your words and take criticism. So I think a lot of friends who started out in that novel writing class with me, they really had trouble taking criticism because they saw it as an insult to their ability or intellect, but it's not. If you have to pick and choose what you listen to, but if three people are saying that a character's not working, it may not be why they're saying it's not working, but the character's not working. So it's just try to keep an open mind and heart when you're hearing criticism. Like it can be very helpful.
That's all fantastic advice.
Oh, good.
Traditional last question. When
Yes.
All the Summers in Between is made into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
Oh my goodness, you should have asked me this earlier so I could have thought about it. So I would say, okay, so there's so much there. The Beatles are such a big part of this book. And actually, there was even a point where I was going to try to get the two friends to Shea Stadium to see a Beatles concert together because I just wanted to write the scene. Like it just felt so fun to be in that moment in time. And I swear I'm going to get to that moment in time at some point in one of my books. But because of that, I would say Penny Lane would be the theme song because the main character, Thea, she and her husband are so into music and they named their daughter Penny after that song, Penny Lane. And I love the idea of like this, young family kind of with this little girl who really it's all about, raising the next generation of strong women in many ways and having this young mom kind of with her daughter. And I could hear that song in the background. Ruby Tuesday's in the book too. There's so by the Rolling Stones. I think that's a really powerful song for the early timeline, the 1967 timeline, because I can see the girls kind of screaming it on the top of their lungs, feeling very powerful. But I think by 1977, it's kind of like Penny Lane is in my ears, right? I can
Yeah.
hear that one a little more for the song. But it's funny because I do write to music all the time, and I think music really helps dictate the emotion of a scene. And so I was having in this book, music dictate the emotions of their lives. I really tried to use it as a way to bond them and show kind of what they were feeling in that moment through some of the song lyrics. And earlier versions of the book had the song lyrics in there that they make you take out because you can't actually use them. They're copyrighted. But the Yellow Brick Road song by Elton John, there's this point where the two friends are biking to the beach and they have a little transistor radio on and that song comes on. And it's so much about regret in the past and evaluating how far you've come. And I feel like when I wrote that scene, I would get choked up to that song. I love that song for these girls. It really resonates. So I guess I have three.
Yeah. Got a whole soundtrack.
I have a whole soundtrack. Actually, somebody recently asked me to make a Spotify playlist because I think there's over 35 songs mentioned in this book from those eras. And I have to
Should do
sing
it.
that. It's just, yeah, I got to do that because it would be fun to listen to.
It would be great. I would love to listen to it. So you have to send it to me.
Yes, I will.
Put it in show notes too. Brooke Lea Foster, thank you so much for coming on. It's been truly a great pleasure talking to you.
Oh, I completely agree. This was amazing. I could talk to you all day.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.